Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to this next edition of the Pandemic Baseball Club Q&A with the authors. Joining me today is our good buddy, Ralph Carhart. He is the author of The Hall Ball. And when is it coming out, Ralph? When is the book coming out?
It should be any day now at this point, quite frankly. It's pretty close to the date that McFarlane told me it would be ready.
Great. And I know that a lot of people out there who have been following your website for a long time and certainly have been following your career. I know of so many people just through our interactions with the Pandemic Baseball Book Club that I know that they're really anticipating the release of it. So congratulations on what has been a journey in so many different ways, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. Yeah.
When I before we get to the actual book and the process and all that stuff, I just want to let the folks know how ironic it was that we both were joined together in this Pandemic Baseball Book Club, because you were actually curating a art exhibit at Queens College, my alma mater, a few months ago. Indirectly, that Todd Radham, the guy who, the amazing artist who did so much for Gotham Baseball, actually donated one of his pieces of work, which happened to be the cover of my book, to your exhibit.
Yes,
so
you very graciously agreed.
That was great. So how did that whole exhibit come about?
I work out at Queens College in Flushing, and I work for the drama department there, actually. But there's, the college community is always encouraging the people who work there to sort of reach out beyond their normal parameters in the ways they contribute to the college and do other things. And this is one of my ways of trying to do something different and explore, a particular passion of mine. So at the end of February, we opened a temporary exhibition that I called Home Base, and it took a look at the history of baseball in New York City, basically from when the early squads, the Knickerbockers, and the clubs that even came before them, were playing on the streets of Manhattan. To the present day. The exhibit, it was in a round room. So if you went into the room and you walked the circle, you basically got a timeline, a history of how New York baseball has developed and grown and been an important part of the game and how it became what it became. So, it had all these really great things. I had some vintage uniforms, replicas of vintage uniforms set up at the beginning so people could see what the game looked like when it first started. I had this beautiful display of cards that were created by Ars Longa Cards out of California, which sort of looked at that, the transition of the game from the amateur sport and took us all the way basically to the dawn of the 20th century, just through all these gorgeous baseball card images he did. I had special exhibits dedicated to Babe Ruth, to Jackie Robinson, to Yogi Berra, to some of the bigger names of the game. And I also had original art. I had art there by artists Philip Dewey and Andy Brown and Greg Kreinler, who is, the man. It was really exciting and fun. And funny enough, just today, I actually was able to get back into Queens College and take it down. It's been sitting like a little time capsule locked inside a room for the last 3 months. Untouchable because lockdowns on the campus, and the campus is finally starting to open enough that I was able to go in it. And today was a bittersweet day because I actually just took the exhibit down this afternoon.
Well, that's an incredible segue, because I know from my own, just when you do something like that, and it's funny. Again, another connection is that, I used to be in the Queens College drama department and appeared in several shows while I was there. So again, This is another interesting interaction and connection between the two of us. I have to admit, this is much like, as I mentioned in my book, somebody approached me with a book project that they were interested in me reading and reviewing. and it was Matt Dahlgren.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually Marty Appel had come to me and said, look, I have this client, Matt Dahlgren, book about his dad, his grandfather, Dave Dahlgren, the man who replaced Lou Gehrig,
Right.
which I knew, but I didn't really know anything other than that. And I was like, Marty, I'm only doing this because, you know, it's a favor to you. I mean, you're going to write a whole book about a guy who replaced, you know, because I really didn't know the story, you know? And so I got the book, I read it, and it was, to this day, absolutely blew my mind. So if you haven't read it, Ralph, definitely read it, because it's called Rumor in Town.
I will.
It is excellent. It really is.
It's funny coming from a guy who just wrote a book about all of the Hall of Famers, but some of the more interesting stories in baseball are always going to be the ones who aren't in the Hall of Fame, the ones who we haven't already heard
these interesting stories, right, that you never knew, you know. And it's funny because this was obviously about, I don't know, it was probably like 10 years ago. And even then, I considered myself a little bit of a baseball historian. And the fact that I didn't know that, really, I kicked myself. And I was like, you know, I will never say that again. I will never assume that kind of. And then somebody told me about your book, and I was like, cemeteries? Graves? You know? And the reason I bring it up is because as I read your book, that's kind of how some of the players that you wanted to, you know, be part of the project, that's how they reacted too. So we'll get into that, because I really have some of my favorite interactions that you wrote about. But let's talk about that aspect of the book, the cemeteries, right?
Okay, sure.
I loved the foreword by John Thorne, who is fantastic, who actually declined to be part of my book, which is hilarious.
The connections just keep happening.
It's too funny. So I love John Thorne. His book, The Glory Days, that he edited about all the, all the great moments from 47 to 57 in New York baseball history. That foreword was some of the best written stuff. I mean, it was just so well done. It reminded me of his book, Baseball in the Garden of Good and Evil, which I interviewed John about many years ago. But what's interesting, Ralph, is that he seemed to really, that foreword grabbed me and really it really got me to read the book with a different lens. So talk about why that was the focus, I guess, in the early going, right? You weren't even thinking about living players at that point, yes?
Yeah, the living players element to it got added a little bit later. The inspiration for it was the cemeteries themselves. The short version of it is that my wife and I are amateur genealogists. We enjoy researching our own family history for a little while. I was even doing some independent researching of other people's histories. You know, I was looking, friends wanted to know their family stories. I was doing some research for them. I love the kind of research that goes in putting together the puzzle of a family tree. And we were in Cooperstown. We go frequently. We're there, we live in New York City, so we can get to Cooperstown fairly easily. We're there 3-4 times a year. And we were there one year in the summer, was around All-Star game time. The Hall of Fame does this really fun thing for the All-Star game, and we were there for that. And one night we were a little early for the game. So we decided to waste a little time. And because such an integral part of being a genealogist is wandering through cemeteries to try and find the stones and make those familial connections, we decided to hit the local cemetery. And while we were there, my wife found a stone for Abner Doubleday. Now, it's not our Abner, the mythological creator of baseball. It was actually Abner's grandfather. Our Abner is at Arlington Cemetery in Virginia. But seeing Doubleday's name written in stone in Cooperstown, it fired something in my head, and it got me wondering what it would take to find all of the graves of the Baseball Hall of Famers. The project grew from there because I came home from that trip and I started doing my research, and I found out that someone had already done that. In fact, I later learned multiple someones had already done it, but there's a SABR member out of Minnesota named Stu Thornley, who had already gone and seen all of the Hall of Famers' graves, and he'd taken pictures and he posted them all, which was exciting for me because he'd done all the research already. I didn't have to do a whole lot of digging to find everybody. but it was digging, but it was, it was also a little discouraging for me at first because, I do work in theater. I am an artist. And for me, one of the most important elements is to try and always tell a story in a new way. My particular passion in theater, and I talk about this in the book, is Shakespeare. And it's a challenge to be a Shakespeare director in the, modern age, because we've been doing Shakespeare for 400 years. So how do you tell that story in a different way? And that's always been a challenge that I've really thrived on. So I decided that I wanted to do something different than Stu. I didn't want to just go to the graves. And the ball came about because on that very same trip, my wife had found that ball in the little creek that runs next to Doubleday Field in Cooperstown. If you've ever been to Cooperstown, it's that little ballpark that's sort of the center of town. And there's a little stream that runs next to it. And the ball was down there, and we grabbed that and brought that home because, if I see a baseball laying in a stream, I'm going to grab it. I've been doing that since Little League. So as I went on the adventure of beginning to find the Hall of Fame graves, and I started right here in Brooklyn, where I am now, I sort of had this, at the very first grave that I visited, I sort of had this epiphany of adding the ball to the journey of visiting the Hall of Famers, and decided that I was going to take a picture of this one baseball at the grave of every Hall of Famer. And that's how, that was the genesis of the adventure and of the story.
Well, it's always great when you have those moments, right? When you figure out that mechanism clicking into place, and then that's where, okay, now I can write the book. For every author, it's different. It could be something as simple as, figuring out how for me, it was the chapters. For me, it was like, how am I going to write this chapter of this player that's been written about so many different times?
Right. You had that particular challenge.
Kind of did the same thing. What you did is you had discovered that other people had done. I remember looking at a site called the Dead Ball Era that had the different graves. It was a Yankee writer. I feel terrible. I can't remember his name, but I remember checking his stuff out. So getting that mechanism and figuring out that's how I'm going to do it. It must have been a relief to you to kind of say, hey, okay, now I have it's not just a hook. It's something that actually, okay, right. Now it's kind of, this is where I'm going to go. This is my map now. So that must have been powerful.
Yeah, it certainly took, I was already sort of excited about the idea of visiting them, especially once I, started to discover just how far and wide the Hall of Famers were buried. And if I was going to go on this journey, the places I would have to go to accomplish it, that had already sort of made me excited about the project. But having this new element to it, being able to create this tangible memento of the trip, it really galvanized the whole thing for me. It's, if you ask my friends 10 years ago when I started, it was all I talked about for about the first 6 months after I came up with it. It was just, have I told you about this thing I'm doing yet?
The other thing I liked about it, look, there's such a honesty in the way that you write and the way that you chronicled your journey through this decade of, really, it really is like, incredible to think about the time that you put into this. Still had a career, it still was able to maintain your relationship.
This is the point where I obligatorily step in and say that I really do have the most amazing wife in the world. And if it were not for her, this thing would never have been possible.
I'm right there with you, but I don't think she would have put up for 10 years. I mean, the 2.5 years I worked on mine, it wasn't easy.
The bonus draw.
Without that kind of support, it's virtually impossible to get this kind of thing done.
Yeah, it's true.
There were so many things I liked about your interactions with some of the living players. But before I get to that, I want to talk about two things. One is, at what point did you decide that you wanted to include the living players? And when did you realize what an obstacle that you had created for yourself to include that? And was there any moment, so it's like really a three-part question, was there any moment where you regretted making that decision?
I was probably about, I think it was after really, maybe it was the first round of visits. It was relatively early into the project that I decided I wanted to add the living guys. I wasn't too far along, but I made that decision in a very, cowardly is not the right word, but a very in a laissez-faire way, because I decided that I wasn't going to put any real energy into hunting those guys down until I had gotten far enough along in the project that I believed I was really going to follow through. We all have those passion projects that we start at some point and we don't really get to the end of. And, I knew getting to the living guys was going to be a bigger challenge. And I decided to wait to start putting energy into that element until it was almost a year later. I didn't start trying to add the living guys until the following July, the 2011 Induction Weekend. I went to Induction Weekend. It was the first time I'd ever gone to an Induction Weekend. I usually, despite the fact that I live in New York City, I'm not a huge fan of large crowds of people. But I knew that my best chance to get the living guys was going to be there. That's the only time all year long where you're going to get 50 to 60 living Hall of Famers in one place. So I made about a year into the journey, I went to Cooperstown for Induction Weekend. And I actually started by talking to the Hall of Fame. I met with Sue McKay. So the part of this that we haven't discussed yet is that the final piece of the idea, beyond the pictures of the deceased players and then adding the pictures of the living players, was what was I going to do with it when I was done? And I decided that what I wanted to do, because again, this theater background, I need an audience. That's just how I roll. I didn't want to make a thing that then just sat in my office. I wanted people to look at it. Right. So I decided that the final little piece that I put together was that after I was done, I was going to donate it to the Hall of Fame. So that first July, I met with Sue McKay, who was the head of the Sessions Committee there, who sort of decides when someone donates to something to the Hall of Fame, whether or not the Hall of Fame really wants it. There's lots of things people offer to the Hall of Fame that they reject because what would they do with it all? They'd run out of space eventually. So I met with her to see if it was at all possible for the Hall of Fame to assist me in contacting the living guys. And their answer was predictably no. The Hall of Fame is very, very protective of the Hall of Famers. There was a long period in Hall of Fame history where not very many players came to Induction Weekend, in part because they felt as though the Hall was not protecting them from the throngs of fans, and they were harassed in restaurants and stuff like that. So the Hall of Fame had to adopt a very protective policy towards the players to get them to trust the Hall and to start bringing them out in the numbers that come in over Induction Weekend. So the Hall is very, very protective of them. So I remember that the end of the conversation with Sue was me saying to her, so do you have any suggestions for how I should go about this and try and get the living guys? And she said, well, it is Induction Weekend in Cooperstown, just go outside. And literally within minutes, I stepped out of the Hall of Fame and I started walking down Main Street. And within a minute and a half, there was a throng of people kind of clustering there. They shut that street down. There's no traffic. There's no driving on that street. There was a throng of people there in front of one of the restaurants. It was one of the restaurants, waiting to have a chance to get Yogi Berra to sign something. And Yogi had a thing set up in front of him. I had made the decision. One of the things that also sort of held me back from going after the living guys was that typically to get something like a picture of a living Hall of Famer, there's usually some sort of financial transaction involved. You've got to you have to pay money for those things unless it's a spontaneous thing that happened, right? If you meet them on the street, maybe they'll stand there and let you take their picture with them. But if they're at a baseball card show or if they're there for Induction Weekend, it's a transaction. So I was intimidated by just what that would mean. There's 70 plus living Hall of Famers. That's definitely thousands more dollars onto a trip that was already going to cost me a substantial amount of money because of all the travel I had to do. And I walked up to Yogi, and I was so excited because he had a little coffee can sitting in front of him. And if you tossed $5 into it, it went to a donation to like a local kids program, and Yogi would let you take his picture. So $5 later, I had my first Hall ball photo, and it was Yogi Berra, which was very special to me. Being a New Yorker, being a Mets fan myself, Yogi's got that beautiful crossover. Everyone thinks of Yogi as a Yankee because of his incredible playing career as a Yankee, but he was an active part of the Mets coaching and managing staff for a very long time. He had an integral role in sort of taking that team and helping legitimize it. So I've always loved and admired Yogi, not just for the reasons that everyone loves Yogi, because he was witty beyond belief and charming and sweet. But, I think he's one of the most underrated ball players of all time, which is crazy to say about a guy who's in the Hall of Fame. But what Yogi did, both behind and at the plate over the course of his career, I think gets the short shrift sometimes. So that Yogi was the first one was super, super exciting to me. The third part of your question, did I come to regret adding that element? Most definitely. Yeah. Meeting the Hall. So I'm not, I'm not a person who chases down fame, which is funny because I have a career in theater. But I have had in my theater career, as modest as it is, opportunities to interact with very famous people. And it's not my instinct. It's a career focused instinct to not really get super excited about that and really try to chase that down. That's not something that appeals to me. I don't have an autograph collection. And that's an important thing for people to know about the ball, is that all I got were photographs. There are no signatures on the ball at all. Well, there's one start of a signature, and that's a story in the book that I'll let you read. But there's no signatures on the ball because that was never really the point. But that fact, that reality that I wasn't chasing a signature, that was sometimes for the living guys a little off-putting. They thought it was strange because that's what they're used to. They're used to people coming up and saying, will you sign this thing for me? And for many of them, it was weird for a guy to walk up to them and go, I don't want you to sign anything. Here's my story. So it was challenging myself personally to sort of diving into that world where you're chasing after fame, which is a thing that I've never really done. But it was also a challenge just in terms of things like, I lost track of how many hours I spent waiting for a Hall of Famer to come off the floor. So the way I mainly accomplished getting the photos of the living guys was I went to the baseball card shows, the local ones that they do up in White Plains and out on Long Island. And I made friends with the people who produce those shows, the baseball card show promoters. And they, they got behind the project because, they're baseball people, they're sports people. They love stuff like this. The story has a fun hook for them, right? So they gave me access to the living guys, which prevented me from having to spend those thousands and thousands of dollars. And I was super grateful that they did and that they trusted me to let that happen. And that typically meant waiting for them. Sometimes, I always got there early in the hopes of getting them before they got out on the floor. And that happened a few times. Usually it meant I was sitting there and waiting for hours for them to not only finish signing the things that the fans were bringing them out on the floor, but typically when a ball player goes to one of those things, once they leave the floor and they go in the back, there's a giant pile of all the stuff that people mailed in that they have to sign as well. So, there were times when I was waiting 3-4 hours to get my picture. And as much as I love wandering around a baseball card show, it got a little tedious after 8 years.
Well, no,
So I was.
Sure, there's no question. And it's always, people don't seem, there are people out there who love to get autographs, right? They love it. They'll stand around and ask for people to sign. I'm like you. I was never, I liked meeting them. Mm-hmm. Lee Mazzilli once threw me a ball when I was out in the outfield at Shea Stadium when he was with the Pirates. So that was cool because he was my guy.
Sure.
After Seaver left, Mazzilli was my guy, Brooklyn kid like me. Italian. I'm half Italian, you know, so I always got a kick out of that moment. But I love the moment. It didn't matter that he, you know, it didn't matter that he didn't sign it or any of that stuff because,
Right.
you know, you lose stuff, you know, and we don't all have trophy cases to put things in.
Yeah, yeah.
I enjoy the moments of meeting, you know, uh, so that I could tell the story. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller, and obviously, the way that you wrote this book, you're a storyteller as well.
Yeah.
And that again, that juxtaposition of the theater, you know, like whenever I would get that opportunity, like you, when you work on a show or you work on a production or you're at an event and you meet someone that is known in the
Mhm.
you know, in the theater world or in the film world. Like for me, it's always like I don't care about even taking a picture as much as I want to ask them about a choice they made in a movie for an
Mhm.
acting move or a directorial decision or something. I'll sit there for hours and talk about stuff like that. I was never really I worked in the memorabilia business for a while, part time with
Mhm.
Leland's. I'm sure you're familiar with them.
Sure.
So you're right. They are usually very helpful when it comes to those kinds of projects.
Mhm.
Um, but I guess the thing I really wanted to talk about was um, your Ralph Kiner moment and how that,
Uh,
you know, crystallized some things for you. And you know, when I was never a big Ralph Kiner fan as a kid.
mhm.
I was a Bob Murphy guy. You know, I was,
Sure.
oh yes,
Sure.
Bob Murphy. You know, I was that was my guy. And so I didn't get and that's why I liked that moment, how you wrote about it, because it didn't really click for me until I met Ralph. You know, I met him when I started to cover the Mets at the end of, as he was retiring and getting ill, and he was still the same person. And when I met him on the field at Shea Stadium, I was like, wow, he really is like the most awesome guy. And then I read his book, Baseball Forever.
Mhm.
So you had a similar kind of moment with Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, Ralph was special to me because I was a kid. I was a little kid listening to him and Bob Murphy. Lindsey Nelson had left by the time I was listening, but I listened to Bob and Ralph the whole time I was growing up. And Ralph was special to me. I didn't mention this in the book, but Ralph was also special to me beyond the fact that he had my name. Um, he looked like my grandfather, who also had my name. So it was super cool to me that there was this Hall of Fame baseball player with my name, and he was a stud. I mean, beyond how many home runs he hit in those 10 years, the dude dated Elizabeth Taylor. Like he was a
Exactly.
stud, you know. And he's not one of those ones. Like if you weren't a Mets fan, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Uh, um, if you were someone who was born when I was born in the 1970s and you became a baseball fan in the 80s, you probably didn't know Ralph Kiner unless you were a Mets fan. Meeting him was particularly special, and it ended up becoming particularly poignant. I met him at the same time that I met Bobby Doerr. They were doing a thing together. So to have Kiner and Doerr, who were, as the two oldest Hall of Famers at the time, I believe. So to have that much history in one space was pretty intense. But Ralph ended up being one of the first, might have been the first Hall of Famer who passed after I took their photograph. And so folks understand, there's only one picture of everybody. So if I took a picture of someone while they were alive, I didn't also go to their grave. So I've never actually visited Ralph's grave in New Mexico. He's the only one in New Mexico. I saved myself a trip to New Mexico because I was lucky enough to get him while he was still alive. And when he passed, it was that was the moment when I realized that the Hall ball was now irreplaceable. I was never going to be able to make another Hall ball that was exactly the same. Like I could start another one tomorrow, but it's one that will never have been held by Yogi Berra or Ralph Kiner or Ernie Banks or Tony Gwynn. There were roughly 8 or 9 Hall of Famers who passed after I took their photograph. And it was very touching to me to recognize that I had inadvertently, that was not one of the things I was thinking about when I began the project, is what happens after they start passing after I take the photo. It was very touching to me to realize that that was sort of a side effect of the ball that I'd never really considered, that this thing I made is now at this point, you can never make another one that is just like it.
Again, I want to talk about, I know that you have just as many, you have more stuff with the graves. Obviously, there's more Hall of Famers that are no longer with us.
Sure.
But, you know, some of your interactions that you had during the course of the book were similar, and even the ones that I found that were dissimilar, like Tommy Lasorda. When I first met Tommy Lasorda, it was at the winter meetings in Dallas, my first winter meetings, which was 2005. And it was right around the time there were rumors that Bobby Valentine might be in line for the Dodger job, or maybe it was he was in line, there was a rumor, and then it didn't happen. Whatever it was, you know, I was a huge Bobby Valentine fan. And since the Mets were dumb enough to get rid of him, you know, I wanted him to go to a place where it would make sense. So I figured, you know, it would be great for him to go work for Tommy at the Dodgers. So, you know, I introduced myself. He's sitting at the bar in Dallas, and it was you know, wasn't that busy. And he had a glass of red wine. Introduced myself, and we had this great conversation for about 25 minutes. And I said to him, I said, wow, I understand why guys want to play for him, because I was ready to run through the wall, you know? And I was so excited that I got to meet him, and we had this great conversation. It was like, I showed him my card for Gotham, because this is when I did the magazine. And he's like, outstanding, young man, this is outstanding. And then I read your book. I'm like, oh man, he got bad Tommy. He got right.
I didn't get bad Tommy. I got Tommy in my mind. I got in my mind what is essentially quintessential Tommy is what I got. I think I got, you know, and he was Tommy. This Tommy story makes me laugh. You know, there were interactions that were not pleasant that I don't laugh about. But I mean, maybe I do a little now because time has passed. But I loved getting raw, honest reactions from them. And, you know, Tommy's an old school guy, and my project is weird. Like I'm fully ready to admit that this thing is a little odd. And so, you know, and these guys see all kinds of nut jobs. I mean, you know, sorry, that's not, poor taste in terms of the language, but there are some people who are very intense in terms of how much they are committed to getting their baseball signed. So, you know, he's seen all kinds of folks, and I think I probably registered for him as one of those folks. And, you know, he wasn't mean or anything. He just gave me a look that basically said, you are a weirdo, kid. And, you know, I can happily go to my grave saying that Tommy Lasorda thinks I'm a weirdo, and I'll take that.
I love that Lou Brock was such a great interaction for you. I had the same experience. And on the flip side, pleasantly surprised. Pleasantly did not, with the Randy Johnson interaction, and I want people to read the book, so I don't want to go through every different interaction that you had, but that's expected from him. I covered him in his short time in the Bronx, and he was just an odd duck, and you would think that he wouldn't be. And when you look at the picture in the book, he's like beaming.
He's super happy.
Because
the part of it that was super surprising to me.
For his photograph.
I know. The part of it that was super surprising to me is that Randy Johnson is a photographer. I thought he would enjoy the photography element of it. I was very clear early on when I first met the Living Guys. I was still trying to figure out my rap, you know, stuff I was going to say to them when I walked up to them, because you've only got, you know, 15 seconds to make your pitch and get your picture in there, right? And so very early on, I just went in and asked for the photo. But soon enough, you know, after the first few, I realized it was probably only fair of me to tell them what they were posing for. You know, what was I taking this picture for? And I thought that he would be excited by the photography element of this book that I was creating, because I'm taking a picture of all of the Hall of Famers. That's pretty cool. Who's done that? But he was unimpressed the first time.
It's just I try to explain to people that you know sometimes when you meet your heroes, you're disappointed. And sometimes they can act in ways that you never expected. I'm glad that you had so many good interactions as opposed to ones that, because really with a book like this, like you said, they're not used to stuff like these. Most, and this is not a knock on ball players, but most of them, they're not, highbrow people. They kind of like their golf and their stogies and their golf. I mean that's what they like to do.
I should have hung out at golf courses more is what I should have done.
Exactly. So I want to talk about two of the bigger chapters that I think that probably were the most difficult for you to write, or at least the most difficult for you to find some of the information. And that, of course, is the Negro Leagues chapter, as well as the Cristobal chapter. So those two chapters, give people the sense of how difficult those chapters were to research and finish, and finalize.
Sure. The chapter that discuss specifically, to be clear, just go back a little bit. The Negro Leagues make frequent appearances throughout the book just because there are a number of Negro Leaguers who are in the Hall of Fame and they're buried all over the place. So I talk a bit about Negro Leagues history throughout. But the two chapters that you're specifically referring to are the first one was inspired by the very first grave that I went to on my restart. And that's another story from the introduction that people will read. The very first grave I went to the very first time was Henry Chadwick. Those pictures didn't work out. I had to start over again. So the very first picture that I took on the restart was of Saul White, who was the great Negro League infielder, manager, executive, historian. He wrote the first book on Black baseball history. And he was buried in Staten Island. And at the time I was living in Staten Island. So I got in my car, and he was the closest Hall of Famer to me, and I drove to him to take his picture. And I learned when I got there that he did not have a grave marker. So my very first grave for the entire project, there was no marker. It was just a flat expanse of grass. So I started doing some research into what it would take to get a marker put there. It seemed strange to me that a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame was laying in an unmarked grave. And it introduced me to Jeremy Kroc. Jeremy is the founder of Sabre's Negro League Baseball Grave Marker Project. He has been working for quite some time, probably longer than the Hall Ball at this point, placing markers at the unmarked locations of where Negro Leaguers are buried. And at this point, he's placed like 35 of them or so. And of course, he knew about Saul. Saul was a target of his. There were some challenges to the circumstances of Saul. Saul is buried in a communal grave. So he is buried with 8 other people. He's got a full complement of a baseball team buried along with him. And getting a cemetery to give you permission to put a marker on a location where there are 9 other people buried is problematic, because if those 8 other families show up and they want to put a marker there, now where do you put it? So it took a little charm on my part to get the folks at Frederick Douglass Memorial Park in Staten Island to give us permission to place a stone there. But we did. We successfully put one there in 2014. That's where I met John Thorne, was working on that project. John was kind enough to come down to the dedication and speak, in his role as the historian of Major League Baseball. We had a bunch of Little League kids there. It was a fabulous event, and it was inspiring to me to see that piece of baseball history that always ends up getting that short shrift, right, of the Negro Leagues, still garnering that much attention from folks from, just placing a simple stone there. And Jeremy, over the course of, when I began the project, there were 3 Hall of Famers, 3 Negro League Hall of Famers who were in unmarked graves, Saul White, Pete Hill, and Frank Grant. And within a couple of months of the beginning of my project, Jeremy Kroc had located, and Pete Hill was the big mystery. No one even knew where Pete Hill was buried when I began the project. He was the one whose gravesite was unknown when it began. And within 3 months of me beginning the project, Jeremy had found out where Pete Hill was buried. And within a couple of years, stones were placed at the graves of Frank Grant and Pete Hill as well. And it was exhilarating for me to just be. I was only a part of the Saul White one, really. The others Jeremy did on his own. But it was exhilarating for me to very early on in the project see the rewards of the work that I was doing, that this crazy project of mine was actually helping a member of the baseball fame get some small modicum of recognition. So that one meant a lot to me. It expanded beyond that 100-fold by the time I went to Cuba. There are ostensibly 3 Hall of Famers buried in Cuba. Martin Diego is there, Jose Mendez, and Cristobal Torriente. And I went to Cuba in 2015 to take those photographs. And while I was there, there was a reporter for Granma, the Cuban Communist National newspaper. He was their sports writer, and he said that he was convinced that Torriente was not actually buried there in Cuba where we thought he was buried. He'd looked through the cemetery records and he found no record of Torriente being there. So I came home and I started doing my research, and I got Torriente's death certificate. He died in New York City, and New York State, has Freedom of Information Act. You can get ordered death certificates online. And so I got a copy of his death certificate, and his death certificate actually said that he was supposed to be buried in Calvary Cemetery, which is in Queens, not far from Queens College. So I went to Calvary Cemetery, spoke to the people there. They eventually found a record for him. The first time I contacted them, I had no luck, in part because they had him listed as Christopher Torriente. And the person that I was speaking to on the phone, I guess, didn't make that leap. So I eventually learned that they did in fact have records of him being buried there. But they had no record of him being exhumed and brought back to Cuba. And that was the story. In John Hallway's book, a former Cuban player, a teammate of Torriente's named Rogelio Crespo, stated that Torriente was exhumed from the grave at Calvary, and he was brought back to Cuba and given a hero's burial. But the folks at Calvary had no evidence of that exhumation taking place. So I was learning all this right around the time that the New York Times discovered the Hall Ball. I heard from a reporter from the Times by the name of Corey Kilgannon, and Corey wanted to know if I had any local activity going on with the ball that he could come write about. Was there anything I was doing in regards to the Hall Ball? And I said, well, I think this guy that I thought was buried in Cuba is actually buried in Queens. And he said, that's it. That's our story. So we went to Calvary Cemetery, and I told the New York Times and subsequently the world that I believed that Cristobal Torriente was buried in Queens and not in Cuba like we'd been told. About a little less than a year later, I got a Facebook message from a Cuban filmmaker named Yesel Porto. And Yesel was doing his own research in terms of Torriente, in specific, a larger research in terms of finding lost Cuban ball players in general. And he believed, found Torriente's body in Cuba. And he wanted me to come down to Cuba and look at what he'd found and weigh his evidence and, sort of help support his theory that he had found him. So I did. I went back to Cuba a second time. I brought some of the soil with me from Calvary Cemetery. Cuban burial practices typically have the body buried above ground until it's decomposed enough that then the bones are then put in a smaller container and moved somewhere else, and then the grave itself is reused. That's what you do when you've got a relatively small land mass. And he believed that these bones that he had found were crusted in dirt. And he wanted some of the dirt from Calvary Cemetery. So there I was in broad daylight with a shovel in a cemetery digging. And I brought some dirt down to Cuba, which I'm fairly certain broke a couple of custom laws on top of it. But I got down there and I became part of their forensic investigation. And I got to, on this second trip, the first trip that I went, I was part of this amazing tour group called Cuba Ball. It's based out of Canada. The second trip, I was there on my own, just doing my own research and my own hunting, and I got to interact not just with Yesel, but the most incredible Cuban historian, a gentleman by the name of Ismael Sene. Sene just died about 6 months ago. I'm so lucky that I was able to interact with him before he did. The man was a font of baseball knowledge, both Cuban and American. He was here in the 50s when he was a younger man. He had pictures that he had taken, as a teenager at Yankee Stadium. There was, Mickey Mantle standing in the, in the on-deck circle, his giant back. And, and these were Ismael's personal photos, and I got to experience those and share those with him. So that was an absolutely incredible experience. But as far as Mr. Torriente, the Yesel and his team certainly have an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, which, if an argument were to be made in a U.S. court of law, would probably not fly. So I left Cuba very uncertain. I to this day could not tell you where Cristobal Torriente is buried. Maybe he's in Calvary. Maybe he's in Cuba. Luckily, since I've been down there, both Calvary Cemetery in Queens and Colon Cemetery in Cuba have placed markers dedicated to Torriente. So now you can, sort of get some sense of his presence in both places, which to me is probably the best possible ending.
And that's really kind of that, why the book is so fascinating, because you have these mundane kind of interactions at baseball card shows.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this incredible kind of like, in search of, you could have Leonard Nimoy, from the team kind of, doing the play-by-play, right? Look, there's so much of that I want to discuss with you with this book, but really we want people to, again, it's the Hall Ball. He's Ralph Carhart, and it's McFarland and Company. Yes,
it is McFarland. That is correct.
And I know we all belong to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, and we want people to certainly support independent bookstores. We have one in Rockaway, the Avoid the Day bookstore and cafe that hopefully will survive this pandemic. The place we love, Foley's, did not survive. I'm hoping that Sean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I've had a fantasy for a couple of years now of the release party being at Foley's, and it was
I know.
It's just tragic.
That's what my launch was supposed to be, and it was canceled like I don't know, like a week before it was supposed to happen. So Sean is wonderful. He's told me that he's in the process of looking, and hopefully hopefully we have a big baseball blast, Ralph, when the new Foley's finds a home. But the independent bookstores, bookshop.org. If you go to,
you can get to portals for all of those bookshops, those independent stuff. If you go into the Pandemic Club, you can get into bookshop. So visit you can buy the book directly through McFarland if you'd like. I would recommend you go to the Pandemic's website, because then you're also checking out the other 25 books that our fabulous team of writers have written, and I'm sure you will find more than one that appeals to you. It's a tough time, to be selling a book right now, especially a book about baseball. Just beyond the larger picture of a pandemic and racial unrest, baseball is collapsing around us. So
look, it's interesting. I think that I'm an optimist, and I think that and I tweeted this the other day. I think the owners are Mr. Potter, right? And the players to me, are the guy who wants all the money he went and put into the building alone. I got $250 in here, and I want my $250.
Sure, I see that.
And the fans are George Bailey, and I think that I'm rooting for George Bailey. I mean, that's who I root for. I root for the fans. And then somebody asked me, well, who are you? And I said, Uncle Billy. Because I would do that. I would get cocky and lose the $9,000. That's me. So, but the the reason I bring it up is because, baseball is the great, I think, unifier. I think that it's hard for baseball fans to be to not understand what's going on in the country, and not to understand, because we've heard the stories, whether it was Curt Flood talking about the roadside diner he went in and they were breaking the plates after the black players had used them, or just the stories of that I got when I interviewed Mudcat Grant, and he talked about how teammates wouldn't even shake his hand, and how little we know of Larry Doby and what he had to put up with. So many fascinating stories that, as baseball fans, we don't. We kind of have heard these stories, and maybe people from other walks of life haven't. So maybe that's why, all of us, especially in the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, have a different kind of focus, and why the group decided not to really promote, Father's Day, the push that we talked about. And I don't know if I agreed with it in the beginning, just because I wasn't sure why we had to carry that weight. But as Jason and everybody talked about it, it made sense. So, certainly, I think that your book certainly is representative of that mindset, of how, these are things that unify us. These are things that bring us all together. And so that's why I appreciated that aspect of your book, because it took us on so many different journeys, and took us, and you got to tell so many different kinds of stories that I don't think people would expect to read in a book that is about the Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in essence, I was like, wow, like when I'm looking through the chapters, I'm saying, wow, like this really is taking me a lot of different places, and because it took you to so many different places. So I want to congratulate you on really a fantastic book. I look forward to sharing it with others. I look forward to people watching this conversation, and thank you for writing it, Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. I hope people like it. I tried to create something that appealed to a broad spectrum of fans, from the casual to the hardcore. I do agree that baseball does have a power to sort of lift us above. And one of the things that I found most fascinating, just as this whole Major League Baseball drama unfolds before us, is the way that people are still staying connected to baseball. They're watching Korean baseball. They're finding other ways to connect. I myself, ever since I got back from Cuba, I make a point of watching the Cuban baseball season when I can. Which has the extra added bonus of happening when there is no Major League Baseball. Right. Largely, they typically play in the winter in Cuba. So it's great to, one of the silver lining on sort of the disaster that is the 2020 season is that people are still finding ways to express their passion for the game. And it's one of the reasons why, even though, selling a bunch of baseball books right now might seem kind of unimportant in terms of the big picture, I do think helping people hang on to that little bit of sanity for them. And for so many people, that is what baseball is. It's that little regular dose of sanity. You every night at 7:00, you can pretty much turn on a radio and just, be transported back. And there's something comforting in that. It is also important for us to not get too bogged down by nostalgia. However, nostalgia is how, some of the tragedies that we see happening in this country right now continue to be perpetuated. People long for the days as they used to be, even if for a lot of people, the days as they used to be weren't all that great. So it's, baseball sort of has that beautiful ability to not only nostalgically make us long for the past, but it has the power, it has the capability, if it's exercised properly, to force us to move forward into the future in a wiser, kinder way. And I hope that is one of the things that happens as a result of this. I hope Major League Baseball in particular does a little bit better at examining its own racist elements. There are still an incredibly small number of Black managers and coaches in baseball, and that's a problem. That's not okay.
And that's a conversation I'd like to continue with you, because it's something that I've written about in my career, and surprisingly, and maybe you'll come on my Gotham Baseball podcast and we'll talk about
I love these podcasts. I'm all for it.
Yeah, but you're right, and it's funny. Whenever somebody says about looking too much in the past, and I love history, but Satchel Paige once said, "Don't look back, because something might be gaining on you." And I always, it's one of his best sayings, and really, it's so true. I love history, and those who ignore it are doomed to repeat it. But I also think that it's teachable, and it shouldn't be the thing. Well, that's what we always did, but it should be, look, let's avoid those mistakes. So you have to know the history. You just don't have to necessarily live in it.
Right. You don't need to embrace it and make it your future.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the big thing. So, look, good luck with the book, Ralph. It was an absolute pleasure having this conversation. I look forward to having it in person with you, hopefully very soon.
Yes, I'm hoping we can raise a couple of glasses at the new Foley's.
Absolutely. Take care of yourself, Ralph, and have a great weekend. And I wish you all the best with the book.
You too. I'll talk to you soon.